what I'd just like to explain very quickly is that for the last sort of 10, 15 years, there's been a huge amount of effort to make advertising and communications more efficient and so forth. Cost cutting, greater attention on the bottom line and so forth. My argument's always been that this strategy is largely wrong. That the real problem of what you might call creative and design talent is that there isn't enough of it and it isn't deployed widely enough. And I'll explain why this is, I think, in the next sort of 5 or 6 slides. But we've just created a thing at Ogilvy called Ogilvy Change. And the aim is to take advantage of the fact that in the last 20 years, there's been more progress in human psychology than there was in the previous 100. And we're not even close to understanding how people really think, decide, and act. But we're closer. We're less wrong, to be honest. And I've often explained, actually, in business, that the thing that makes business different from academia is that in business, you don't actually have to be right. You've just got to be less stupid than your competitors are. Business is, a little like an ecosystem, a little like evolution. You don't have to be perfectly right. You've just got to be a bit less wrong. And so the aim we have with Ogilvy Change is these are currently the sort of scope of problems that creative talent and human psychological insight, I think, can solve. And these are the ones we're currently asked to solve. And a lot of this is historical. If you look at the structure of the advertising agency, until about 20 years ago, you were paid by the media. So whenever you were given a problem to solve, your first question, this wasn't conscious, it wasn't cynical, it was just automatic, was how can we solve this problem in a way that involves giving the media a lot of money so they'll give some of it back to us? We're no longer paid by the media, but I think the muscle memory, if you can call it that, within the advertising agency, the way agencies are structured and the way they tend to think, still carries with it quite a lot of memory of that time when, well, okay, this obviously involves mass communication of some kind. Now, how can we redefine the problem so that the solution involves mass communication? And we think you can change that. And I'll just give you 2 little examples of how we're successfully, I think, moving out of that little circle. 2 small jobs we've done. In both cases, they involve 2 recent psychology graduates, average age 25. In one case, they went up to a call center for a day, and this was a call center of one of our large clients. And I can't give away every detail, but it sells subscriptions to a publication. And they spent the morning listening to the conversations the people had. They spent the lunch break talking to the call center staff, saying, from what we know about human psychology, these phrases might help. Now, I'll give you just one example of a phrase. Previously, the person on the call said, I'm glad you want to subscribe to this publication. We have 3 choices, A, B, or C. And the psychology graduate said, in the unconscious human brain, we massively look for proof in terms of what other people do. We have a social epistemology, if you like. Okay? We don't actually think what is good for me. We also need reassuring information like lots of other people do this. That's just how our brains instinctively work. There are millions of years of evolution. Before we even evolved speech, we were thinking in this way. So one of the sentences they just changed was, they now, instead of saying you can choose between A, B, and C, they simply said most people choose B, but you can also choose A or C. And they made about 2 or 3 other changes to little sentences, just like that. The conversion rate of the call center went up, it tripled. It went up 3 times. So of every call they got in, now 3 times more were converting to sales. And it was tiny little phrases. Has anybody here read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow? Few people. He makes a distinction between parts of the brain which are system 2 and system 1. System 1 is unconscious, effortless, very, very quick. 1 plus 1, 2. Even in a foreign language, you probably go 2. You didn't have to think about it. If I say, what 17 times 24, suddenly you can feel you're muttering to yourself, your eyes roll up in your head. That's because you're using system 2. Most decisions either originate from and are entirely taken by System 1. Emergency braking. I'm really glad, by the way, that most of the time we drive a car, we're doing it automatically. Okay? I don't want people to go, that's very interesting. The car in front has decelerated dramatically. I wonder what are my options in response to this new situation. Okay? You instinctively just brake. Nearly all decisions, in fact, I would say, yeah, practically all of them, can't be made unless you have System 1 approval. Unless it instinctively feels okay, you can't do it. You can't actually act. There's a great Coca-Cola phrase, which is, reasons only lead to conclusions, emotions lead to actions. That all actions, if you want people to really change their behavior, then what you need to do is actually work out what is stopping this behavior, and it may be that there's a System 1 fear somewhere deep there. And talking to a drinks brand, for example, we worked out a very simple thing, which had never occurred to anybody before. There is no chance in hell you will ever get a man to order a cocktail at a bar unless he can see a photograph of the glass in which it will be served. Okay? Now, lots of people like cocktails. I think lots of people prefer cocktails to wine and other things. But there's this System 1 fear. Even if there's only a 0.001% chance that the drink arrives in a hollowed-out pineapple with an umbrella and a sparkler, that's enough to stop System 1 rubber stamping the order of a mixed drink. Okay? Now, just to prove it's not just me, this is a book called Complexity in the Art of Public Policy by two people. Called Kuipers, I think he's Dutch actually, and Cullender, David Cullender, who's an economic historian. And their point is that human economic behavior, human behavior in general, is a complex system. It's much more like traffic or meteorology than it is like clock repair. And the trouble with economics and the trouble with the obsession in government and business about having certainty is that that's just a completely artificial requirement for most things that actually involve humans. There won't be perfect certainty. That's the bad news, if you like. The good news with complex systems is sometimes very small changes can have very big effects. And we tend to assume, even in communication, we have this kind of Newtonian view of how persuasion works, which is, the people are this big force, and the harder you push, the more they will move. Sometimes maybe it is like that. A lot of the time, actually, the people want to move in that direction anyway, but there's a tiny little thing blocking them. Robert Cialdini, who's written a wonderful book on persuasion, which I really recommend, he makes the point that actually a lot of behavioral change interventions, they aren't like applying power to something, they're like flicking a switch. The actual built-up energy was already there, you just have to turn it on. And there are lots and lots of cases. I'll give you an example, perfect example, which all of you will recognize. Only 4 seats left at this price. Anybody who's been to an airline website knows the magical effect that has on action. What's fascinating to me about this is I've spent the last 10 years studying what you might call behavioral biases, and this is scarcity bias. If we perceive something to be scarce, we become much more eager about acquiring it. And I know all this stuff, it still works on me. I go, I don't know if I really want to, there are only 4 seats. I better book it now, okay? A lot of the time, very, very small little switch flicks. It's almost like, don't think of human behavior always as being something you have to push. Sometimes they're pushing that way already. They're pushing on the door. All you've got to do is move one little part of the barrel in the key, and the door swings open. And we don't spend enough time looking for those tiny things, because we tend to have this mentality, if we want to have a big effect, we have to do something big. Actually, tiny little changes to wording, tiny changes to layout can make you millions of pounds. Now, these people also make the point that what's happened with all these economic and business decisions is they've been hijacked by people like economists and finance directors, because they have numbers, and so therefore they can present things as though they're certain. And what Kuipers and Cullender say, individuals who think of problems in other more creative ways, and I would include creative people, communications people, marketers in general, Are discounted or labelled irrational. We think this is a big loss. Humanists might not be able to translate their complex insights into the math underlying the standard policy compass, but they have important insights which have been lost to policy. Let me give you a little example of this where I think this is something on a huge scale. I don't know if this works in Sweden, but in Britain you pay a tax rebate to anybody if they put money into a pension. And so, effectively, if you put £1,000 into a pension every month and you're taxed at 40%, the government gives you £400 extra, either in money back or into the pension, so that you're paying the pension from untaxed income. That costs the UK government about £56 billion a year. I mean, an absurdly large amount of money. Now, I asked the question, I said, I would argue, from my knowledge of human behavior and psychology, that about 30 billion of that is just overcoming the fact that pensions are appallingly badly designed in terms of human psychology. Go to a 28-year-old and say, hand us your money in a large sum now, and you might see it again and a bit more when you're 64. It's a ridiculous proposition to begin with. But then I tried another experiment. I had an audience of 400 people from the largest retail bank in the UK, and I said, if I gave you £200 now, and I said, you can keep that £200 provided you pay £200 into your pension before you get home this evening, how many of you will be able to do it? Nobody. I went to another audience of 300 people, same offer. How many people would know how to put £200 into your pension now using a laptop, a mobile phone, a phone call, if you like, before you get home this evening? One person knew how to do it. He worked for Goldman Sachs, so he wasn't exactly representative. Okay. Now, first of all, where they're paying billions into pensions to encourage people to save, but the mental process of actually saving, the human brain is not stupid. It goes, surely if I was supposed to top up my pension like that, it would have been made easy for me to do so. But it isn't, so presumably I'm not supposed to do it. That's the first way the human brain works. If lots of people did it, or I heard about people doing it, or my bank said to me, hey, how about topping up your pension? Then I'd probably do it. But the reason I never do is no one ever suggests it, and it's really difficult to do. And then I asked a second question. If you did put that £200 into your pension, how would you know that the money had got there? And the answer is you wait 3 months for your pension company to send you an incomprehensible load of rubbish through the post. You remember that you paid £200 in, and you remember to check. Now, one thing, and I'll tell you more about this later, one thing we're starting to know about the human brain is it really, really hates uncertainty. It would rather have definite bad news than possible bad news. I mean, literally. And there's an argument that some people say that if you say to someone, even uncertain good news makes people unhappy. If you say to them, actually, there's a 1 in 3 chance I might be able to get you tickets to the Wimbledon final, they actually end up less happy than they were before. Okay, now I'm not sure whether that's right or not, but certainly one of the things I said to British Airways, I think it's the best bit of advice I ever gave in 25 years working in advertising. I said to British Airways, never ever put up a sign at an airport next to a flight that says delayed. Okay, I said, you make up a time. I said, put delayed 60 minutes, delayed 30 to 60 minutes. Delayed 90 minutes, delayed 10 minutes. We're fine, okay? We'll go, oh, God, it's an hour late. Okay, I'll ring someone, say I'm going to be late, and I'll go and use the Wi-Fi and have a beer, right? We're okay with that. If you put up a sign that just says delayed with no other information, you might as well just put up the words, be unhappy, because there is no difference in terms of the psychological effect you have. Now, the other thing about the human brain is that it's pretty weird. It isn't actually weird. When you look at the deep evolutionary reasons behind a lot of very strange human behavior, it actually has a beautiful elegance to it. But a lot of the things about it are deeply strange. What we say, the most important thing is what we say we like isn't what we really like. So the part of the brain that does the talking isn't really connected to the part of the brain that does the deciding. Okay? And that's one of the things. So the second thing is that in many cases, the part of the brain that does the talking, our opinions and attitudes are actually formed by our behavior, not the other way around. Now, it works in both directions to a degree. But most of the time, the direction of travel, as psychologists agree, is you behave in a particular way because of certain circumstances, and then you develop opinions that fit in with your behavior. Now, it's very difficult for us to actually get our heads around this because the bit of our brain that does all the thinking is convinced it's in control. Most of the time, it's not the Oval Office of decision-making, it's the press office. It's hastily inventing plausible post-rationalizations for decisions that have already been taken somewhere else. There's a very mischievous and politically incorrect phrase that Paul Dolan, who's a professor at the London School of Economics, he and I came up with this. And I kind of apologize for it, okay? But it's a very good description of how the brain works. When a man says, "My wife doesn't understand me," it doesn't mean he's planning an affair, it means he's already had one. Do you see what I mean? That what actually happens, we like to think that the brain works like a kind of McKinsey organization where you evaluate your spouse on a balanced scorecard every quarter, and if you notice your declining levels of empathy and affection, you then outsource sexual and romantic services to a range of competing providers in low-cost economies. You know what I mean? That's kind of logical. What actually happens in reality is someone gets drunk at a party, they snog someone they don't like very much, okay? And on the way home, in a desperate attempt to make sense of their behavior, they develop this completely bogus case against their wife. Do you see what I mean? And you see this on TripAdvisor all the time, okay? Have you noticed how many really bad reviews of a restaurant? The restaurant was unfriendly, the people were unhelpful, the food was bad. And then you read the review and it starts with, "We had booked a table for my mother-in-law's birthday," right? Now what it is the bloke's in a really bad mood because he just wanted to stay at home and watch television and get drunk. But he's been forced to spend £200 of his own money taking this miserable old bag out to lunch, okay? Or out to dinner, okay? So he's in a hugely bad mood. He can't really admit the real reasons behind it. So he just contrives a completely bogus case. Restaurant's horrible, food was terrible. No, he was in a terribly bad mood while he was there, but there wasn't much the restaurant could have done about it, to be absolutely honest. Now, talking about this, test counterintuitive things because your competitors won't. The insights that are really valuable in marketing and in communication are the ones that don't make obvious sense. Because the ones that make obvious sense, everybody kind of knows about already, okay? If you're in a competitive environment, you've got to understand the things that make no sense. This makes no sense, right? Two reasons it makes no sense. One, when they researched it, people said it was the most disgusting carbonated drink they'd ever tasted in their lives. The company that researched the taste of Red Bull in the West said, "We have never seen a drink do worse than this in taste tests." Comments back from people being researched included things like, "I wouldn't drink this piss if you paid me to," right? The other thing that doesn't make sense about Red Bull at all is they managed to charge 3 times as much as Coke for a canned drink by making the can smaller. Okay, so something in the human brain goes, "Woo, that can's really small. That must mean the drink's really, really powerful. Because if I had a full 375 milliliters, or full, 750 milliliters in a can of Coke, is it? Okay, if I had a full can of that, I'd probably go mad or die. So it must be really, really powerful because they put it in a small can." Okay, now both those things are in total defiance of market research. It tastes horrible. Total defiance of economic logic. No one in a market research group will ever say to you, "Oh, no, I wouldn't pay £1.50 for a canned drink. Oh, wait a second. I would if you gave me less of it," right? No one's ever going to tell you that. You can only sort of find it out in that sense. And setting aside a certain budget, if you can, for testing things that don't make sense is really, really important. Because if you never find out the things that don't make ostensible sense at first, they're the really valuable things to find out. Now, let me explain this in terms of biology and nature. You probably know bees do a thing called the waggle dance, where they come back to the hive and they do a wiggly dance up the wall of the hive, and the direction in which they move relative to the vertical tells the other bees in which direction pollen's been found. And it's in a direction relative to the position of the sun, in fact. And I think the dance also tells them the rough distance at which it's been found. So the other bees go, "Well, that's handy. Let's useful information there. I'll go off in that direction for that distance and look for more pollen." And then what they discovered is that 20%, it varies a bit, but let's say 20% of bees ignore the waggle dance completely. They're just going, they're kind of like rebel punk bees. Screw you, I'm going off over here, right? And scientists thought this was pretty strange, because they said you'd think over sort of 80 million years of bee evolution, then kind of bee accountants and bee compliance officers would have come along and said, no, we need a greater degree of conformity to the waggle dance. There are a load of people going off and doing their own thing. This is clearly inefficient. And of course, in the short term, it is inefficient, by the way. What's interesting, though, is they modeled it mathematically and found without the rogue bees, without the punk bees, the hive would eventually starve to death, because it would never be able to actually acquire new information about new sources of pollen and would become completely fixated on some sources of pollen which might be near exhaustion. So it wouldn't be able to adapt without the bees, basically the punk bees, are actually the mechanism. It's a bit like artists within society, I would argue, are the punk bees. Most of them fail, a lot of it's ridiculous, but they are the people who occasionally just stumble on a new source of wealth, a new direction in which society goes. And I think that's a really, really important point, that actually marketing and communication must be efficient overall, but don't try and make everything you do have an ROI. Some things should fail. If you never fail, you're not being brave enough. There's a great phrase, if you've never missed a plane, you've spent too much of your life at airports. Okay? And there's a bit of truth in that here. If you've never actually done a marketing thing that didn't work, you're probably being too cowardly. And so the vital thing I always say is, look, most understanding of people comes through this crappy pair of binoculars. One of them is sort of standard economic theory, and the other one is market research. They're not useless. They convey information which can be very insightful and good, and which can often help you sense check things and so on, but that neither of them is either complete in the view it gives, nor is it entirely accurate. And sometimes it's actually diametrically wrong. What people tell you is actually the opposite of what they actually do. So here's a bit of a dig at economics. This is where economics should sit as a proper science. Physics sits on maths, chemistry sits on physics, biology sits on chemistry, psychology sits on biology, and economics is basically should be driven by an understanding of psychology. There are no enthusiasts of the Austrian school of economics here. There's sort of Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, Schumpeter. No, the Austrians believed that. They thought that actually economics should be a subordinate discipline to psychology. But what modern economics has done is it pretends it sits there between maths and physics. And as a result, it freezes psychology out of the picture. In order to look mathematically neat, it also pretends to ignore lots of things that are true about the world. So it imagines that every decision is made in an atmosphere of perfect information and perfect trust. Now, if you've ever wondered why your finance function hates marketing instinctively, it's because in a world of perfect information and perfect trust, you wouldn't need marketing at all. But the fact is that those conditions exist somewhere between very, very rarely and never, effectively. So, this is a really, really dodgy thing, in that what economics is a form of sort of slightly aspergic approach to how people decide and act, as though we weren't a social species, and as though we didn't have mistrust and doubt and uncertainty and fear and everything else. The other point is this thing about how our brains work. Jonathan Haidt, I'll give you the title of his book at the end of this talk, brilliant guy from now at NYU. He describes the brain as a rider on the elephant. There's the conscious bit, that's the system 2, and then there's the unconscious, which is the elephant. The elephant is instinctively huge parts of our brain. It's a herd species, it's a creature of habit. You can train it, but you can't actually override it completely. You can simply train it. The rider can nudge it, direct its attention somewhere every now and then, but fundamentally you can't get the elephant to do something it doesn't want to do. Now the problem is when you conduct market research, you end up, the thing about the elephant is it can't really talk. It can trumpet and stamp its feet and go off in a huff and refuse to move, okay? But it can't really talk. The bit that does all the talking is the kind of rider. That's the press office, not the Oval Office. And the problem is if you spend all your time talking to that, you'll develop communications that effectively talk to the rider but not the elephant. It's like writing software for the wrong operating system. You can win the argument with reason as far as the rider's concerned, but the elephant still doesn't move. And so you could say, well, hold on, if we actually use communications which subliminally affect people, is that dubious? It can be, by the way, yes. You can undoubtedly kind of trap the elephant. I think, we need to be conscious of this and we need to be honest about that. There are things I've seen which are what I'd say are exploiting system one. But equally, the other thing you've got to say is when we design a car, every car has a steering wheel. You steer with your hands. Your hands didn't evolve to steer cars. What good designers do is they design cars and doorknobs and kettles and things like that to work with the evolved physique that we have. That's what we've got. There's no point in trying to design a car that you steer with your nose because you'd crash, right? So we steer with our hands even though our hands aren't for steering cars. In the same way, we've got to design choices that work with the brains we've got, that work with our evolved psychology, just as steering wheels work with our evolved physique. I'll give you just a little example of this here. The design of choice is a really, really important thing. Because the way we think we choose isn't the way we really choose. We really choose one attribute at a time. We don't actually do a balanced scorecard of different things. We choose one comparable attribute at a time. So when you go out for a meal, you'll basically go, where do we want to meet? What sort of food do we want to eat? Now, if you change the order of those questions, you'll go to a completely different restaurant. A lot of the time, what we do is we ask questions at a point in a process where the person can't really answer them. Now, for a long time, airline websites were an extraordinary case of this, in that they were absolutely fine if you're a business traveller. They asked the question, okay, where do you want to go, when, what class of travel do you want? Those were the three questions. Now, if you're a business traveller, that's probably the right way to do it, because you go, well, I need to get to Malmo on Thursday, and I need to be there by 2 o'clock, okay? Now, those questions I know the answer to right away, okay? Because generally in business, my boss never says to me in business, I'd like you to go somewhere quite sunny, somewhere between Wednesday and, next Friday, right? Okay? Or I'd like you to go somewhere where the flights are really cheap, right? Generally, business travel works that way. Leisure travel doesn't work like that at all. But the airline websites had exactly the same order of decision-making, okay? And then they asked the stupidest question of all, which was, what class of travel do you want? Well, the answer is obvious. We all want to go first class, but it depends how much it bloody costs, right? It's not like business travel where you're told what class of travel you can go in. The answer is obviously, well, look, if business class is 50 quid more, I might go business class. If it's 500, I won't, right? And yet they asked you that question before you knew what the price difference was, which was just completely bonkers. Now, they've changed that now, so that if you ask for an economy ticket on BA, they will automatically show you the premium economy and the business class prices. Doing that brings in an extra £10 million in revenue every year, that one single change to the website. And I discovered another case. I don't suppose anybody knows the M20 motorway, which leads up to the M25 if you're driving from Dover to the M25. Nobody? Yeah. Have you ever missed the turning to the M25? You haven't? No, okay. The reason I asked, it's a really weird question, because I was in Johannesburg describing this problem, and two people in Johannesburg said, yeah, I've made that mistake. Now, what actually happens, okay, you're approaching the M25, which is London's orbital motorway, and the first sign you get is this one. And it just says M25. It doesn't give you any distance. Is it a mile away, 3 miles away? Where's the junction? And it doesn't really give you any useful information about, say, Gatwick or where you need to turn. So you go, well, that gantry is rubbish. I don't really understand what's going on. But you can see on the horizon a second gantry. So you go, well, no need to panic, because I'll just wait till I get to the second gantry, and I'll make a decision when I actually get a proper bit of signage that makes sense. That bit of signage is terrible. Now, this is what happens before you can even read the second gantry. They divide the two roads. And by the time you can actually realize you're in the wrong lane, you can either swerve dangerously and illegally across there to avoid hitting a tree to get into the right lane, or you drive 10 miles too far in the wrong direction. Now, in the UK, every single audience I've presented this to has 10 or 12 people in the audience who said, I've missed that turning. And what that is it's just the information is provided with no sensitivity to the point in the choice, what you might call in the choice journey. There's no intelligent interplay between the information when you give a piece of information and when the person's free to choose. And actually, funnily enough, I did go to the Highways Agency in the UK, and much to my surprise, they said, you're absolutely right, this is completely mad, we're changing it. They haven't changed it yet. Let me also explain around choice and the psychology of choice. You don't have all that much free will, right? Now, how many people in this room secretly, okay, being honest about it, would rather drink like gin and tonic or whiskey or beer or cider than drink wine? How many people are there who are wine skeptics, who just aren't that keen on? Yeah, I'm one of them, okay? By the way, with food, I'm not totally dissing it, okay? I'm just saying we drink wine more often than we should, right? And particularly, for God's sake, you're Swedes. You should be bloody spirits drinkers to a man. What are you doing? What are you doing drinking this Southern European peasant drink for? This is shocking, okay? You know, I thought, you know, anyway. If you look at what happens, restaurants want to sell wine because they can mark wine up a lot because you don't know what the wine costs to begin with. People know what a bottle of Johnny Walker costs in the shops, so you can't just multiply that by 6 when you sell it. With wine, you can buy a bottle of Chateau d'Obscur, and nobody has a clue what it originally cost, okay? So you get to the restaurant, and there are already wine glasses on the table. That's a bit of a clue. You know, it basically says, we're expecting you to drink wine here, you know, because we've put the glasses out ready. Then they hand you a wine list. No, they say it's a drinks list, but they don't call it a drinks list, do they? They call it the wine list, okay? The wine list consists of about 9 pages of different kinds of wine, and then there's 1 page of beer and spirits at the back for like perverts and weirdos who don't want to drink wine. And then the final bit of choice architecture, of total choice architecture, is they only hand out 1 wine list. Now, if you think about it, if one person's choosing for the whole table what everybody's going to drink, there's only one thing you can drink, because there's only one alcoholic drink that comes in shareable containers, which is wine. I mean, you could order a 2-litre bottle of Dr. Pepper, but that would be really weird, okay? So effectively, once that guy with the wine list says red or white, the whole decision's been made for you. You're having wine, okay? No one's really had a choice. You've just been trammeled through it, a bit like the M20, the signage there, okay? So, you know, the extent to which we have free will is worth debating, because a lot of the time we have a context which is created for us, which just bullies us into one social norm or other. A few more things, which I think are important. Really small things can have huge effects. This is a blog post called the $300 million button, and it shows a case where they added a single button to the checkout process of, I think it was Best Buy in the States. And previously, if you're a past customer, it said sign in. If you're a new customer, it said register. And they added a third button which said check out as guest, and a little sentence underneath said, you don't need to register to shop with us, but we'll give you an opportunity to save your details later. That single button at the checkout process added $300 million every year and up to their online sales. Because something about our elephant brain didn't like handing over the information to it. Now, but there's a bit more than that, because you go, but that's just because people don't like leaving their data, right? You know, they're a bit paranoid, like Germans, you know, about, you know, leaving data. Have you noticed that, Germans? There's no Google Street View in Germany, have you noticed? Because Google just gave up. Because they, I do not want a picture of my house. Anyway, but anyway, so you just go, okay, people are a bit weird about data. No, after they checked out, 90% of those people were perfectly happy to leave their data. They just didn't want to do it first. Now, I don't fully understand what's going on here, but what was fantastic is I was presenting this, and what's wonderful is you can discover things on the internet which have wider application elsewhere in life. It's almost like fractal human behavior. You know, you can see the same patterns recurring everywhere. And the fantastic thing was I was presenting this, and a lady came up to me after the presentation and said, I spent the 1980s and early 90s working with HIV patients in New Orleans. And we found the same thing. I said, well, hey, what do you mean? And she said, no. People came in and said, I want a test to see whether I'm HIV positive. And they said, what's your name? And the people disappeared. Then they tried a thing where they went and said, okay, your patient number 407962, come back with that number and we'll give you your test results in 2 weeks. And the people came back 2 weeks later. Now the interesting thing is, after they'd had their test result, it didn't matter whether it was positive or negative. They were completely happy to leave their name and address details. Because the problem they had with anonymity is that if someone was positive, you kind of needed to know who they were so you could follow up. You see? But the strangest thing was, positive or negative, once people had had the result, in both cases, they were totally happy to leave their details. In a state of uncertainty, they weren't. So that same thing seems to recur all over the place. Small things have huge effects. Putting ice in cider. There's been a huge cider revival in the UK, partly driven by Copperberg, which I'm told is just a brand that teenagers drink here. Is that a bit unfair? Am I being a bit unfair? Anyway, but Copperberg is very popular. But this, interestingly, the Irish brand Magners, they produced bottles which were too big to fit in the fridge. And in their desperation, this is the rumor anyway, I haven't heard full confirmation, but there are various rumors. One other one is they just couldn't get fridge space. So in desperation, they said, put ice in the cider. What that did is it suddenly made the fact that people were drinking cider visible. Do you see what I mean? Now, Guinness knows this. There's a massive thing that Guinness understands called the lighthouse effect. If you go into a pub and there's one person drinking Guinness already, you think about drinking Guinness and you're actually, you quite often order, you're much more likely to order it. If nobody's doing it, nobody orders it. The elephant is a herd species. That's what I was saying once again. You know that feeling, okay? You all have had that feeling where you go into a restaurant, maybe on holiday, and after you've gone in, and the guy who owns the restaurant's kind of said, come in, lovely food, you discover you're the only person there. And it's the most depressing feeling in the... Now, you've had no relevant information about the quality of the food or the prices or anything else, but just the fact that you're the only person there makes the experience feel crap. And we're just like that. That's a case where, extraordinary transformations can happen just through tiny things. Previously, everybody drinking cider was assumed to be drinking lager because they're kind of the same color. Tiny little subtle things we do in terms of what you might call unconscious inference. There's an Indian restaurant in London. If anybody goes there, Dishoom, D-I-S-H-O-O-M. It's fantastic, okay? But the thing that mystified us is we said to them, how come you're full at lunchtime? Every other Indian restaurant in London, they do fine in the evenings, but they're empty at lunchtime. This place is actually full. Now, one reason is it's just very, very good. But we noticed something else, two other things. One, they open for breakfast. So by about 11:30 or 12 o'clock, there are already people in there, so you feel okay going in. The problem with an Indian restaurant at lunchtime is when it's empty, no one feels like going in. Now, I used that insight. I was advising a jewelry firm, a jewelry firm in Denmark, actually, and they had a shop that wasn't doing very well in Copenhagen. I said, how many members of staff do you have? They said 4. I said, when the shop's empty, tell 3 of those 4 staff members to pretend to be customers, because other people will go in happily. If there are other people browsing at jewelry, the 5th and the 6th and the 7th person will go in. If there's nobody in there, nobody goes in. It really is like that. And this thing, they put tables outside. Something in the elephant brain makes the unconscious inference there are tables outside, so it's an okay place to eat at lunchtime. No other Indian restaurant does this. If you look on TripAdvisor for Indian restaurant outdoor dining, London, you get nothing. And we just make these unconscious inferences all the time. The other great thing about tables outside, by the way, is they really clearly say you're open. It's better than a neon sign saying open, in many respects. Other ways you can design for the elephant. If you want people to finish antibiotics, don't give people 26 white pills. Okay? Give them 20 white pills and 6 blue ones and say, when you finish the white pills, take the blue ones. People will finish the course of treatment. Okay? You don't have to advertise, you don't have to use persuasion, you don't have to bully people. Just design the thing so it's the natural thing to do. And the other thing is to understand is, I said that the human brain is pretty damn strange. We don't even perceive the world objectively. We don't even look at the world, genuinely, we don't look at the world and see it the way it really is. Evolution isn't really that bothered about truth, okay? It cares about fitness. And if it's to our evolutionary advantage to perceive the world in a distorted way, that's how we see it. So interestingly, I had to give a presentation once where there was a green carpet and then this long black thing from the podium to the wall. And I kept on thinking it was a snake and moving away from it. Now, we have an evolved, predilection, tendency to be slightly alarmed of long, thin things on the ground. Okay? it's a bias because, you know, we should be impartial. But the fact is, it's much better making the mistake that way around. Because if you went go, ooh, it's a snake. Oh no, it's only a bit of cable, okay? That's embarrassing, but it's not fatal. Making the mistake the other way around, look at that lovely stick. Oh, it's a snake, right? The people who made that mistake tended to exit the gene pool fairly young, okay? So in evolutionary terms, as I'll show you here, our perception is not like a scientific instrument. Our eyes are not like light meters. Our ears are not like recording equipment. And therefore, when you design the world objectively around numbers, you may not be actually optimizing the things that the human brain actually perceives as important. High-speed rail, I'm a massive skeptic about, because some of the time it's brilliant, and some of the time it's pointless. It's not worth spending £40 billion to reduce a journey from London to Manchester from something like 2 hours, 9 minutes to about 1 hour 34. Now, don't get me wrong. In France, okay, Lyon, which is I think the 4th biggest or 3rd biggest city in France, Lyon to Paris used to be 4 hours. Now it's 2. That's worth doing. Because someone from Lyon can go to Paris for the day, they don't need to pack a suitcase, and they can be back in time for dinner. They won't fly, they'll take the train, okay? Nobody flies to Manchester anyway from London, right? So it's not as if you're competing against the planes, because there fucking aren't any, okay? So there's nothing to compete against. But also, you know, when I go to Manchester, I do this 5 times a year, in human terms, engineers go, we've increased the speed by 43%. But that speed increase is only relevant if it's important to the human beings on the train, okay? Now, don't get me wrong, okay, a trip to Manchester now, when it's 2 hours and 9 minutes, involves a technical length of time which is called a day out of the office. And £45 billion later, my trip to Manchester will involve, I might get up 20 minutes later. That's about all the difference it's going to make. Not worth the money once you translate the engineering metrics into human metrics. Far better, as I said with the Eurostar, put Wi-Fi on the train. It would have been better and cost 0.001% of the amount of making the trains faster. There's still no Wi-Fi on the Eurostar. Now, if you want to compete with aircraft, what's the big advantage of trains over aircraft? It isn't really about... By the way, the human perception of time is very, very malleable anyway. No, the important thing is to design the world around human metrics, not around machine metrics. Now, let me just show how different our perception really is to how we think it is.
At any one moment, we are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this. What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba, ba, ba.
It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect.
Ba,
Take another look.
ba,
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
ba,
Now to the left of the screen.
ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So the mouth movements we see as we look at a face can actually influence what we believe we're hearing. If we close our eyes, we actually hear the sound as it is. If we open our eyes, we actually see how the mouth movements can influence what we're hearing. Ba, ba, ba.
It's a bizarre effect. Remember, the only sound you're hearing is ba with a B.
Ba, 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 ba.
What's remarkable about this illusion is even knowing how it's done doesn't seem to make a difference.
Ba, The effect works no matter how much you know about the effect. I've been studying the McGurk effect for 25 years now, and I've been the face in the stimuli. I've seen stimuli thousands of times, but the effect still works on me. I can't help it. The speech brain just takes in that information and doesn't care about what outside knowledge you bring to bear.
Basically, what your brain does is it takes what available information there is and makes a bet. And in that case, it's making the bet, it's more likely I've misheard than I've misseen. So the brain, without any conscious intervention, just overwrites a B with an F. It's a bit like data correction in IT. And visual stimuli, we make a bet. Because it's to our evolutionary advantage to make good bets rather than depending on certainty. Do you see what I mean? That the creature who actually most of the time makes a pretty quick, pretty good decision based on reasonable amounts of available information is going to outcompete the person who hangs around waiting for perfect information. Every single time. And take a look at this one. You've got a white square and you've got a grey one. If you hold up your hand in front of your eyes so that you cover, so your hand covers the bit between here and there, you'll see that the top and bottom are exactly the same colour. Our perception, by the way, is very, very relative, not absolute. But also, like the McGurk effect, we fuse different things without knowing that we're doing it. So wine tastes better if you pour it from a heavy bottle. I promise I'm not making that up. Analgesics and painkillers are more effective if you tell people they're expensive. They're also more effective, that's objectively more effective, not just reported effect, if they're branded. The fact that it's branded just makes it work better. We fuse the information together and we make a bet. You've probably seen those visual or artistic things where you think that dots are either popping out or concave. Now, if you turn those things upside down, it's reversed. What's going on there? The brain is there making a bet. It goes, the ones that are dark at the top are probably dimples, they're concave. The ones that are dark at the bottom are probably convex, they're sticking out. Why? Simply because the bet is it's more likely that light is coming from above than from below. We don't know whether that's innate or whether it's learned. To find out, you'd have to bring up some babies in a sort of cellar with a really brightly lit floor and see how they responded to the stimulus, and you probably wouldn't get ethical approval for that. But our perception, the vital thing about our perception is also very relative. It depends on context. And that's true of things like price. Genuinely. Anybody here got an espresso machine? How many people have got one? I mean, they are insanely expensive, okay? If you had to buy an espresso, I've got one, I love it, don't get me wrong, okay? If you had to buy an espresso in a jar, like Nescafe or like Maxwell House, you couldn't bring yourself to do it. Because you'd have a big jar of Nescafe, and it'd be, you know, in my currency, at least we've got our own currency, eh, folks? Anyway, sorry. But in my currency, it would be £4.50. And then Nespresso, if it were sold in a jar as a powder, for the equivalent amount of caffeine and volume of liquid, would be about £60. And you look at that and go, that's completely insane. There's no way I'm paying that. It's mad, right? But here's the interesting thing. Nespresso doesn't come in a jar. It comes in a little pod. And we don't know what an individual Nescafe costs, so we never make the comparison. So our frame of reference when we use the pod isn't Nescafe, it's Starbucks. And we go, well, it's 29 pence for that pod, but that would have cost me £2 in Starbucks. This machine's practically making me money, okay? That's the way. Now, Maserati and Rolls-Royce stopped selling cars at car shows where they looked really, really expensive, and they started selling them at yacht shows and plane shows. If you've been looking at a Learjet or a Gulfstream or a 100-foot yacht all afternoon, and you've been thinking, well, that's 1.2 million, or I see you can get a quarter share in that for £500,000, oh, that plane's £10 million, and on your way out, you see a Rolls-Royce for 350,000. You go, oh, I'll have a couple of those. And we've all done that, right? It's much easier to sell someone a tie if you've already sold them a shirt. You know, we don't actually, our perception of nearly everything, there's one exception actually, people with perfect pitch. It seems to be the only instance where people are, and only a minority of people, are possessed with what you might call an objective perception. There's nobody we know of with perfect temperature. I'm going, about 20 degrees. You know, there's nobody who can do that. Other things, the things that economics doesn't understand, and this is where I'm sympathetic. I'm not a sort of communist or anything, by any means. Bit of a Thatcherite, to be honest. But this is where I'm very sympathetic with the political left. which is there are a lot of things that really, really matter to people that economics doesn't understand at all. All economics understands is individual enrichment and assumes that by maximizing individual enrichment, you'll make everybody else happy. The net effect will be collective happiness. And broadly speaking, by the way, I think in a very poor community, I think that's roughly true. I think there isn't a bad correlation sometimes between those things. But the idea that that's the whole story is terrible. There are loads and loads of things we really care about. Autonomy is one of them. Having some freedom of choice really, really matters. People are happier on an aeroplane sitting in seat 17A if they've chosen it than if it's allocated to them. Now I've said various things about, say, the National Health Service in the UK, which is actually, I think the problem with a lot of public services is if nobody wants to have complete choice, but if you just give people a small amount of choice, would you like a bed by the window? Would you like it, would you prefer to be treated in this hospital or that hospital? It really, really changes how the elephant reacts to the service. So that's one really important thing. Relatedness, we like to establish relationships with the people we do business with. I don't know, if anybody here lives in a smallish town, you always use the same taxi firm, right? Now, an economist would say, no, you should ring all the taxi firms and ask for a competitive quote, okay? Or you should use them, depending on different things. Now, there's a good reason, if you understand game theory, why we use the same taxi firm. If you're a reasonably loyal customer, you are a reasonably valuable customer. If you're a reasonably valuable customer, you have a credible threat of defection. If your taxi firm pisses you off, you'll take your whole business somewhere else. If you're a non-loyal customer, none of the taxi firms give a shit about you. So when it's Christmas and it's snowing and you need to be picked up at 1 o'clock in the morning, you won't find anybody who can be bothered to pick you up. So in game theoretic terms, a lot of customer loyalty is much more intelligent than we do it instinctively. We also understand reputation instinctively. When I was about 24, we were all living in London, about 4 student friends who'd all left university about 2 or 3 years before, and we'd just about got enough money to buy our first crappy second-hand car. And second-hand cars are cheaper in London, actually, but we all did the same thing. We went back to the town where we'd grown up 100 miles away, and we bought a second-hand car from someone vaguely known to our dad. Now, we didn't know why we were doing it. We were like salmon returning to spawn. We were just doing this instinctively. Only years later, I worked out what it is that the guy who's selling cars in a town of 8,000 people isn't going to sell one of his dodgy cars to the son of someone who lives locally, because word will get around. He depends for his future business on not having my dad going around the pubs of Monmouth going, don't buy a car from Dave, the one he sold my son was shit, right? So this relatedness thing is a really clever instinct. By the way, brands, think about it. We prefer brands because a famous brand has a reputation to lose. It's vulnerable to bad word of mouth. Someone you've never heard of without a consistent identity or without reputation at stake doesn't have anything to lose. There's some really, really important ways we can reframe human decision-making. One of the things about human decision-making is we all pretend we want the best thing, but what the elephant means by best isn't the same as what the rider means by best. The rider means some sort of mathematical optimization. What the elephant kind of means by best is something that's pretty good and that definitely isn't shit. Okay, it's a different equation. Why is McDonald's the most successful restaurant in the world? It isn't the best restaurant in town anywhere, right? In that sense of best. It's incredibly good at not being bad. You've never been ripped off, you've never been ill, you've never been disappointed because the food tastes exactly the same. In terms of the absence of negatives, which is what the elephants, and for evolutionary reasons you can think why. We really like food that's identical to food we've eaten before. Because if it didn't kill us last time, we feel okay eating it again. Ray Kroc of McDonald's said, people don't want the best burger in the world, they want a burger that's just like the one they had last time. And anybody here got youngish kids? Around the age where kids start to be able to crawl, they become super conservative with food. So if you take their favorite food and you just add a small amount of basil, they go, it's disgusting, okay? That's that thing of it's an evolutionary mechanism to stop children just eating things at random and poisoning themselves. They only eat things they've eaten before. Fortunately, they go through that phase. Certainty. Have you got Halo or Uber here in Malmo? Have you got Uber yet? Halo? Okay, taxi booking smartphone apps, okay? The real job, you could always phone for a taxi. It was never that big a deal, right? But the real big deal of Uber and Halo is that, first of all, you just say, here's where I am, location on map, pick me up here, okay? Now, what was awful about ringing for a taxi is between ringing for the taxi and the taxi arriving, you entered the twilight zone of uncertainty. It was like that British Airways sign saying, delayed, right? You go, why isn't he here yet? They said 10 minutes. He said 10 minutes, it's been 12 minutes now. Go outside, see if he's parked round the corner. What if he's left? Should we ring him up now? Here, you just watch the cab on the map approaching. And instead of getting all tense, you just go, oh, he's stuck at those traffic lights. I'll make myself a cup of tea. So it changes the objective reality hardly at all. It changes the psychological experience massively, absolutely massively. So that's just one of those brilliant, what I call psychological innovations. Fairness, another thing. Whatever economists think, we have an innate sense of fairness. Not only us, but our closest biological relatives have a massive sense of what is fair. Do you have a phrase, le gomme, or is that Norwegian? Is that Danish and Norwegian? Sort of proportionate. Yeah, oh, thank you. I've got, my pronunciation is clearly rubbish. Sorry about that, okay. There we go. But here's just an example of fairness in the primate.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So there are these innate system one elephant forces. If you're doing great communication, don't just talk to the rider. Now, if you do too much, if you rely too much on research, you'll end up listening to the rider. Sometimes the rider gives you an accurate view of why it does things. Sometimes it's just doing, my wife doesn't understand me. It's just contriving a story to make sense of, emotions or whatever. And it's very often, by the way, a wonderful case of a very, very good researcher who understands behavioral economics and behavioral science very well. He was researching quite an upmarket chain of bookshops in the UK among relatively downmarket, uneducated people. And every single person in the groups kept saying, I'd never go in there, the staff are really rude. You see? He was thinking, bookshops, they may not be, super friendly, but generally, you don't wander into a bookshop and the guy goes, bastard, I don't want your sort in here. Okay? So this is a bit weird. So he asked, can you give a case where someone was rude to you? No one could give a single specific instance. And his point is, what it is, it's quite a sort of literary bookshop. The people who he was researching go in there once a year to buy the biography of a footballer for their nephew, okay? They feel slightly intellectually inadequate in that setting. That makes the elephant uncomfortable, but the rider isn't happy to say, I feel socially awkward in a bookshop because I'm not a very literary person. So it just contrives a completely bogus story about the staff being rude. And you've got to really, really watch that, because you could spend millions on staff retraining when actually probably the problem is the layout of the bookshop. Or maybe you need to open another brand, which is called Footballers' Biographies, or whatever. So understanding this is really important. One last thing, there's a German guy at the Max Planck Institute, very good psychologist called Gerd Gigerenzer. Has anybody heard of this guy? He's written a book called Risk Savvy, which I really, really recommend. It's one of the best business books of the year, even though it's not really intended as a business book. But he also identifies something which I think is really important in the elephant's view of the world, which is called defensive decision-making. This, by the way, explains why anybody in a communication role, why you find it hard to sell brave work. It isn't because the person you're showing the brave work to thinks it will work less well. It's because there's a very different mental mechanism, defensive decision-making, where the elephant is not asking what's the best possible statistical likelihood here of what I should do. It's actually asking, if the worst happens, in the worst case scenario, what is the worst case scenario where I come out least badly personally? If you buy boring work and it doesn't work, everybody else says you're unlucky. If you buy brave work and it doesn't work, the brave work may be more likely to work, but if the brave work doesn't work, nobody says you're unlucky. They say you're an idiot or you are a fool, and they blame you. Okay? They don't sympathize, they blame. Now, we understood this. We had just an example of solving a problem for a client. British Airways flies to New York from London City Airport. And it's an Airbus, I think A319. It's only 32 seats. It's an all-business class service, 2 flights a day in each direction. If you live in Kent or Sussex or Essex, or you work in the city, or you work in Canary Wharf, for about half the population of London, and if you're allowed to go business class, this is the best way to go to New York, I would argue. And also the airport's tiny, so you only have to check in about 15 minutes before the flight leaves, and the whole thing's pretty effortless and cute. So we asked the question, how come this thing isn't overbooked? How come there isn't a waiting list? How come we're not charging a price premium for this? And the honest answer is, because it's business class travel. And business class travel is booked by an intermediary, typically a company travel agent and a secretary or assistant. Now, their mental mechanism is, if you think about it, I want to do something that won't get me shouted at. Now, if you book your boss on a flight from Heathrow and the flight's delayed, your boss blames British Airways because you've done the obvious thing and it's British Airways who've cocked up. The second you do something original, you book your boss out of London City, if the flight's delayed, he might blame you. If you think about it, nobody ever shouts at their secretary, what the hell were you thinking booking me a flight from the world's second busiest international airport, right? Nobody says that because it would sound ridiculous. Heathrow, what the hell were you thinking, right? It's the default. So you never get blamed for the default. If you do something better that's a bit brave and eccentric, even though statistically it's a better decision, now if you think about it, in the public sector, this mentality can become really, really endemic, which is the mentality is, I'm going to look at all the possible outcomes from a decision, and I'll take the decision where now in medicine, it's catastrophic. People refer patients to completely unnecessary tests because the whole question is, if I refer someone to a specialist and something goes wrong, it's now the specialist's fault, not mine. You can get sued for not doing something. You can't get sued generally for doing something. So all these biases absolutely distort institutional decision-making and often make it very, very conservative. But they also affect, this is my last slide, I promise, they also affect football. The best thing to do if a World Cup match goes to penalties is for at least 2 of the people taking penalty kicks to welly the ball right down the middle. Nearly everybody goes left or right. But I think it's over 90%. The goalkeeper, similarly, should occasionally stay in the middle, but he always dives left or right. Why? It's not to do with what's the statistically highest probability of scoring a goal. It's about what happens if you miss. And so if you kick left and the goalkeeper goes left, you're unlucky. If you kick right, the goalkeeper goes right, you're unlucky. If you kick down the middle and the goalkeeper still saves it, everybody goes, bloody idiot, you weren't even trying. And similarly with the goalkeeper, the one thing he can't afford to do is just stand there and watch the ball go zoink to his right. So this is an extraordinary case where what is actually the best? Now, there is a way around that, which is arguably for the manager to say to player number 3 and player number 5, I want both of you to kick the ball down the middle. Because then they have an out, which was, I was told to do this. This wasn't my choice to kick it down the middle. We had a plan. I stuck to the plan. They now have a defense, which means they're not ridiculed. But it's a really, really important thing to understand, I think, in decision-making. And, of course, to go back to my very beginning, it's defensive decision-making that stops men asking for a cocktail until they know what the drink's going to look like. Because it isn't a question of what do I want to drink. It's what, if I order a beer like all my mates, there is no risk of ridicule. The second I do something eccentric or different, there's the chance that this happens. And even if the odds are only 0.05%, it's enough to stop them trying. So understanding mental mechanisms, the fact that when we say good, what do we really mean? Do we mean good or unlikely to be bad? I would argue that most people pay a premium for brands, not principally because they think they're better, but because they think they're less likely to be bad. It's a form of mental insurance. Someone with a brand is less likely to sell a bad product because they suffer reputational consequences. Someone who's unknown isn't. But looking at the brain and understanding how the elephant works as well as how the rider thinks it works is, I think, the most important task over the next 10 years. I think it's the next internet in terms of transforming quality of human life and, in some cases, economic activity. But it's not purely economic by any means. And the final thing is we're not there yet, but here are some books which will help you get closer. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Mr. Sutherland, and now it's time for some questions. Dick, will you please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, my goodness, you've got a lot of them there.
Yes, I have indeed. Thank you very much for an inspiring talk.
Pleasure, thank you.
Just inspiration is one of the issues that I come back to regularly when thinking about communication. I think it's important in order to develop further. Where do you find your inspiration?
A lot of it is from, partly, actually, those aren't bad, actually. I mean, seriously, a few of the best books are really, really useful. I also get inspiration from the world of design, from just generally actually being surrounded by creative people, because actually it is other people. Everybody who is claimed to be, I was talking to, does anyone know Stuart Brand, who's one of the people, sort of Ken Kesey in the electric Kool-Aid acid test. He says everybody has their guild. And it's not a formal thing, it's not named, you don't even meet simultaneously, but everybody has their own kind of mental guild, which is not just what am I thinking, but I wonder what they're thinking. And I think, creating, you don't even need to know necessarily the members of your guild, but having a few really interesting people who you follow. One of his, by the way, I mean, bizarrely, if you think about the fact that he's a kind of environmentalist, but one of his is Brian Eno. So it's quite an unusual, but I think having that sort of, assembling a reasonable mental guild of people who will reliably surprise you.
So where do you find those people? Because, as you say, creativity is it can be hard to come across as well.
Actually, I think one of the things to do is not to be very narrow about where you seek inspiration. So, one of the mistakes, growing up in the advertising industry and the direct marketing industry in the late 80s, and there are a lot of things that have gone wrong with the ad industry, but one thing it's better at is that there's generally greater acknowledgement of the talents of other people. Seriously, in the late 80s, in an advertising agency, you regarded design as like poison. It was extraordinarily fragmented. And I think one of the things to do is to take creative industries and have quite a broad repertoire. There's very good advice on music. One of the worst mistakes, there's a good economist actually called Tyler Cameron, who says the worst mistake that everybody makes with music is they feel they have to choose a genre. Now he said, look, the first thing people do, by the way, is they get rid of 3 genres. The first 3 to go typically are metal, country, and sometimes rap. Okay, people just write them off. Okay, probably actually in Sweden you've been into death metal, aren't you? You've been into that sort of, is that the Norwegians who have basically where every band ends up murdering the other members?
That's Norway.
That's Norway. Isn't it? Okay, yeah. Sorry, I'm unfairly stereotyping you there. Sorry, I'm sorry. But you know, but as he makes the point very good, the very best of metal and the very best of country is very good. So you know, one of the things I think is to actually be quite eclectic and broad in where, and you know, that's the thing I learned to do from being fairly much a specialist. I still think a lot of things that direct marketing did and taught me are kind of right and useful, by the way. But I think one of the things direct marketing was really right about was start with the transaction and work outwards. Because if you don't get the transaction right, everything else could be working at suboptimal efficiency. There's no point in doing the greatest advertising campaign in the world if no one actually wants to clip the coupon when they finally get. But I think, so I try and look for, but there's one area where I get a lot of inspiration from is actually effectively evolutionary biology. Because I think one of the interesting things is that complex systems, actually I'll give you a fantastic example of a book you should read. Jeremy Bullmore says the best books about advertising aren't about advertising. There's a book I think by someone called, is it Oppenheimer? Called Traffic. And it's just about traffic. By a very good American writer. Now, traffic, of course, is a complex system, and there are loads of counterintuitive things, there are butterfly effects, all that kind of thing. And so, strangely, reading that book called Traffic has been one of the most sort of useful and inspiring things I've done. And what I think we do is, one thing the human brain does well, it's very good at pattern recognition. It's very good at spotting patterns. So if you read a book about traffic, and there's some really interesting things about traffic. I mean, the fact that if you have a sort of high-density motorway with the traffic at sort of maximum density, just flashing your brake lights can cause a wave of brake lights to move backwards at 200 miles an hour and can cause a traffic jam 4 miles away, like 3 seconds later, that you're not even aware of causing. That sort of interconnectedness. So I think one of the interesting things is reading about, say, evolutionary biology, reading about things that are about complex systems, and then seeing if you can spot recurrent patterns in other complex systems, I think is interesting.
You mentioned in the beginning that small changes can have a big impact, like the rear backlight. The
butterfly effect, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But how can you actually find and see these changes and where? I mean, they might not be that obvious.
The first thing is just to acknowledge that they might be there, because most of the time, part of the problem with organisations is if you give someone a €1 million budget, they kind of look for €1 million solutions to spend, because it's beneath our dignity. And I've said, look, one of the things we say is, it's not unreasonable for a marketing director of a large organisation to spend 2 days of his working life trying to improve the application form for a product. And you often get that problem of natural hierarchy where those small things are beneath the dignity of the people who have the power to change them. Do you see what I mean? I mean, arguably that decision with British Airways, where you actually change the choice architecture, that's possibly that's probably the most important decision they took all month. But it's not normal for, say, the chief executive of a huge international airline to get involved in web design. And I think part of the thing is we have this slogan for Ogilvy Change, dare to be trivial. Which is, it's just now the second thing is, to some extent, you have to test. Because you can't be there are certain things where you just can't be. I mean, I'll give you an example of something which makes a big difference, but it's impossible to say whether it works or whether it doesn't, is whether you charge €1.99 or €2 for something. There's a really big difference. Sometimes it's actually better to charge 2. Sometimes it's better to charge €1.95. And the only advice I could ever get from experts in pricing was it makes a big difference. You have to test it because we have no rules as to say when one is better and when the other is better. We just don't know. One of the ways to get rid of standard economic thinking is it's perfectly possible that many of your products would sell more if you put the price up. Okay? Now, economists, if I say that the price-demand curve doesn't always slope in one direction, economists get really, really angry. But there are lots and lots of situations in the real world where that's exactly what happens. People actually, in the art world, it's most famous because, you know, someone who wants to spend £4,000 on a painting doesn't want to buy a £2,000 painting. I bet someone came to my office and said, I've got to leave early now because I've got to go and meet my friend who's trying to sell a house in Richmond for £50 million, right? Shit, okay. So anyway, he called me up the next day and said, effectively, it's a Chinese woman. She's effectively got 200 million quid that she wants to get out of China, okay? And she wants to spend 200 million on property in London. Now, the truth is, you see, what she really wants to buy is Buckingham Palace for 200 million pounds, you know, whatever, you see what I mean? So she's almost looking for more expensive homes so that she actually can get rid of her money while only buying 5 homes rather than having to buy a whole street. I mean, you know, there are plenty of cases. If you look at restaurant menus, you know, people to some extent use price as a proxy for quality, and people who want to treat themselves want to pay more. I get very annoyed. This is really, I'm probably the only person in the world who ever says this. I get annoyed because you can't buy expensive aspirin anymore. You know how there aren't any brands of aspirin. You can buy, you know, Nurofen is ibuprofen. You've got Panadol and things which are expensive paracetamol. But aspirin, the aspirin that sells is mostly generic. And I'm kind of going, this isn't a 50p headache. I've got a £3 headache. You know what I mean? But I mean, a large amount of human economic activity is people wanting to spend an amount which is commensurate with the importance of the thing. I think cheap broadband is one of those things where actually the market leader in the broadband space is often actually the most expensive. And I've often wondered if this isn't true of everybody. Some people buy broadband on price, emphatically, you know. But for most people, their broadband is so important at home that actually, you know, they're prepared to pay quite a lot. They'd actually rather pay more, in a sense. And I think, you know, because, you know, they want the reassurance that they've got the best thing they can. Because, you know, if your broadband goes down for 3 days, your life is pretty much messed up. And I think, you know, I think there are lots and lots of cases where economic logic actually destroys business value. Because people say, we must try and make this cheaper and cheaper. Well, it's also the point, you know, in a reasonably wealthy economy, well, okay, you make your thing cheaper. What else are they going to spend their money on? They'll probably spend it on, like, fashion or something, which is even more bonkers. You know, do you know what the annual spend on fashion and beauty is worldwide? By the way, annually, I heard this: $1.7 trillion US. Now, I did say, you know, if women could just agree to sort of throttle back a bit, we could actually cure world hunger and build a massive spaceship with that money. But anyway, well, you know. But
that's a final question.
Sorry,
that's a final question. To build that spaceship, you need courage. And you've been stressing the importance of having courage and you know,
or in a weird way, you need courage, or you need a really good CEO who knows to actually provide. David Ogilvy once was really impressed with a client of his. This guy had worked for Mattel and made a mistake where he'd ordered like 1,000 times more plastic dolls than he was supposed to. It was a catastrophic mistake. And David Ogilvy said to this guy, he said, are you going to fire him? And he said, no, hell no. He said, I fire the people who don't make mistakes. Now, the interesting point there is, that may be a bit extreme and a bit of a bad incentive, but the point being that if you have a corporate culture where it is understood that the people at the top have got your back and will reasonably defend you when you make a reasonably brave decision, you don't need to be that courageous because it's you know, there's an understanding. And one of the things I've always said about working in an ad agency, for all its faults, there's a brilliant thing in the ad agency, in a sense, in the what you might call the conversational culture, which is you'd almost rather be wrong than be boring. I mean, people would rather say something wrong and interesting than... Now, that sounds like a terrible thing if you're a scientist. But the argument I've always made is it does create an environment where you can very freely discuss things. Now, I've gone to sort of government bodies in the UK, and one of the things, the first thing you notice is paranoia about saying anything silly or wrong, because you feel it's career destroying. Now, I'll just give you an example of this, which is very funny, because just to be clear, my suggestion was not a good idea, and I didn't think it was a good idea. The point was it was an idea from which a good idea might come, you see. And I was discussing the fact that the government does nothing to actually thank people who pay more tax. Now, in ancient Rome, they actually had a wealth tax, and it was such an honor to pay the wealth tax that people who weren't asked to pay it said, "Oh, I'm much richer than that. I should be paying this as well." And they just put up a statue to those people, and they actually volunteered large amounts of money, you see. Because the strange thing about Sweden, by the way, you've got this reputation for being really egalitarian, but 5 families own the whole country. I've never really understood that. Is that fair? Okay? I've never really understood how you get away with that. But the point I made is, look, there are ways in which you can get people voluntarily to pay a bit more. Or, as any marketer knows, all you have to do is just attach a bit of symbolic value. It's got to be a bit of real value and a bit of symbolic value, but every marketer knows you can get rich people to pay more for things, disproportionately more, just by giving a bit of display value in return. So I just jokingly said, what you should do is have a scheme where, you know, people who pay higher rate tax in the UK should be allowed to drive in the bus lanes. Okay. Now, the point is, that wasn't a serious suggestion, but it's the reason I made the suggestion is because maybe out of that idea, something actually practical and useful will arrive. But what was interesting is in a room full of civil servants, there was just total terror. Because, and what I realised afterwards is their whole terror was that a newspaper would get hold of it and it would say, Conservative government debates, you know, allowing higher rate. And they're so frightened of reputational damage that you can't say anything interesting. And that becomes really terrifying, I think. It really, really frightens me.
On that note, I will thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Inspiring speech.
Oh, is it cheese?
No, it's
It looks lovely.
a small treat for the flight home.